Welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you.
2 days ago, we started off our Vampire Month with Nosferatu, the 1922 unlicensed German adaptation of Dracula. Bram Stoker's widow Florence was anonymously alerted by a letter, and a German high court demanded that all copies of Nosferatu be destroyed. And they were, except one that resurfaced in America in 1929. It wasn't perfect, it was missing some frames, but it was in good enough condition to be watchable. The popularity around Nosferatu's American premiere led Universal Pictures to decide to adapt Bram Stoker's 1897 novel too. And 2 years later, Universal Pictures released Todd Browning's Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. The popularity of Dracula led Universal on a kind of early Marvel Cinematic Universe thing for monster movies. The Monster Cinematic Universe, I guess? Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman and the Invisible Man, Daughter of Dracula, Phantom of the Opera, Creature from the Black Lagoon, House of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, where Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman and the Hunchback of Notre Dame all meet, like the Avengers or something. Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, where Dracula is trying to find a brain to put in Frankenstein's monster. Abbott and Costello meet the Invisible Man, Abbott and Costello meet the Mummy, and on and on and on. In 1958, the British director Terence Fisher did a Dracula remake starring Christopher Lee.
Who has done this thing? Who has done this thing?
Bringing the story home to London rather than having a fake England on the Universal lot. Although there had been an aristocratic, and some would say queer-coded, sensuality to Bela Lugosi's captivating performance in 1931, it's Christopher Lee with his deep voice and British spy charisma who's credited with bringing a real sexual undertone to his Count Dracula. Although interestingly, Christopher Lee is famous for not saying much dialogue as Dracula, as the screenplays weren't usually up to his standards. The Christopher Lee Dracula brought red contacts, wooden stakes, and the fangs we know as Dracula's calling cards to the performance. This type of sensuality, more raw and charismatic than what Bela Lugosi had gone with, and the most different possible interpretation of what Max Schreck did in Nosferatu, stuck with Count Dracula. In 1979, Universal Pictures entered their remake period, with John Badham of Saturday Night Fever fame making his own version of Dracula. Starring Frank Langella as Dracula and Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing, this aimed to make Dracula into more of a love story, even using the tagline, a love story. Frank Langella said, "I didn't want Dracula to appear stilted or stentorian or authoritarian. I wanted to show a man who, while evil, was lonely and could fall in love." The 1970s was a bit of a renaissance for the vampire genre. In 1979, Werner Herzog also released his own remake of Nosferatu, returning to the name Dracula rather than Count Orlok, and replacing all the names chosen to get around German copyright law to the originals, but keeping Nosferatu's vampire as a horrible, corpse-like, ugly Strigoi. Klaus Kinski, Bruno Ganz, and Isabelle Adjani starred in the synthesized Dracula Nosferatu remake. Christopher Lee also returned more than once, announcing in 1970 an intention to make the most accurate Dracula adaptation yet. 8 years later, Christopher Lee and Jesus Franco released Count Dracula, and their adaptation in old Dracula features on young women to stay young-looking. Christopher Lee would play Dracula 10 times, eventually coming to hate the role. In the 1980s, nobody really bothered to make another Dracula movie. I guess now Americans didn't see bloodsuckers as evil in the age of Reaganomics. Now we come to our movie tonight, Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. The 1992 adaptation owes its colossal presence on the screen to Godfather Part 3.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Winona Ryder was supposed to play Mary Corleone, but had a nervous breakdown right before shooting and collapsed. She had to back out of the shooting, which led to the now infamous casting of Sofia Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola's daughter, in an emergency casting decision. Since famously that was a debacle, Winona Ryder healed up and then came back to Francis Ford Coppola's office to make amends and to explain what had happened. Convinced that Coppola hated her, she carried an olive branch, a screenplay that she had just read from James V. Hart, the screenwriter behind Hook. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Briefly glancing down, Francis Ford Coppola's eyes lit up. He loved Dracula and had always wanted to adapt it. This film combines many of the things I've mentioned in this intro. Gary Owen plays the lonely, eccentric, sensual Count Dracula, who is a 430-year-old vampire of the Order of the Dragul. An ancient Transylvanian nobleman who fought the Ottoman Turks to save Christendom. He returns home to find out that his wife, Elizabetha, played by Winona Ryder, has committed suicide after falsely learning of his death in battle. Enraged, Vladdy Daddy renounces God, stabbing the cross and drinking the blood, turning him into a vampire. Bram Stoker's Dracula is both decadent and extremely horny. We skip to 1897, where a rotting Vlad is still moping around his castle. He decides to buy a new home in London, first having Tom Waits' Renfield come as a real estate agent before turning him into a crazy slave.
Something larger, perhaps? Oh, yes. A king. I beg you. A little sleek. A brave king. Something I can teach.
In the real estate office sends Jonathan Harker, played by Keanu Reeves, with probably the most uneven British accent I've ever heard. It's a bit incredible.
25th May, Budapest. Left Budapest early this morning. The impression I had was that we were leaving the West and entering the East.
Keanu Reeves is engaged to Mina, also played by Winona Ryder. After seeing her picture and how much it looks like his former wife, Dracula leaves Harker to be sucked dry by his 3 wives, one of whom is Monica Bellucci. Dracula heads to London to try to win and seduce Mina. Fighting her best friend, whose 3 goofy suitors, one of whom is mental asylum owner Dr. Sword, they don't really like that. So they contact Dr. Sword's former teacher Van Helsing, played by Anthony Hopkins in all his glory. Gary Oldman's Dracula is pretty impressive. He's young, he's old, he's a wolf man. He's almost comically corpse-like while old, but upon falling in love, he becomes a virile young man bent on seducing Mina. The set design in dark reds and blacks is beautiful. Coppola, in an eerily familiar move, was determined not to use CGI effects and hired a special effects team, who told him what he wanted to do would be impossible. He'd only get what he was asking for by digital effects. So he fired the special effects team and hired his son, Roman Coppola, to supervise visual effects.
Given that the book Dracula was written around 1900, being the same date as the birth of the cinema, and not only that, but the birth of the cinema coming out of magicians and illusions and basically magic tricks, I thought that I would not only make the film entirely in a false place, in a studio, but I would only use effects done as they would have been done in 1900.
I have not been getting what I've been asking for. I have been asking for shadows and illusion and double impositions and
It's all done in camera with multi-layered shots, changes of perspective, mechanical effects, and stage magic. However, unlike with his latest work, Coppola was determined to be on time and on budget. But this promise hit snags. First, Winona Ryder and Gary Oldman had a mysterious sudden falling out on set and couldn't stand to work together. Winona tried to leave as soon as principal photography was done. The cut that Francis Ford Coppola brought to the writer Jim Hart was apparently terrible. They cursed at one another and desperately tried to save the film. Focusing on the ending specifically, they decided they would need to lop off Dracula's head and have Winona do it. But she had already left the film, and it took almost a year between principal and these new written scenes to finish the film. They had sold the movie as a faithful adaptation of Dracula, but the central Mina and Dracula love story is not in the book. In the end, they got it done for $40 million, and on finally getting it into the theaters, they made back $30 million just opening weekend, finally making $215 million at the box office. It was nominated for Best Art Direction at the 65th Academy Awards and won Best Costume, Best Makeup, and Best Sound Design.
Do you think Madame Curie would invite such comparisons? Really? I shouldn't have come here.